In the early years of the Second World War, one simple problem kept frustrating military commanders on every front. Artillery shells were powerful, accurate, and deadly, but only if they actually hit their target. And in the modern battlefield of the 1940s, hitting the target was becoming harder than ever. Anti-aircraft gunners faced an especially difficult challenge. Enemy aircraft were flying faster, higher, and more aggressively than any planes seen in previous wars. A bomber moving at 400 kilometers per hour could cross the sky in seconds. By the time a gun crew aimed their weapon and fired a shell, the aircraft was often already somewhere else. The only way to destroy a plane with traditional artillery was through a direct hit or by exploding a shell extremely close to it, but both options depended on crude fuse technology. Most artillery shells used either contact fuses or timed fuses. A contact fuse detonated only when the shell physically struck something. That worked well against buildings or vehicles, but against an airplane moving hundreds of kilometers per hour, the chances of a direct hit were incredibly small. Timed fuses were supposed to solve that problem. Before firing, the gun crew would set the fuse to explode after a certain number of seconds. The idea was simple: calculate the distance, estimate how long the shell would fly, and set the fuse to detonate near the aircraft. But war rarely cooperated with mathematics. Even a tiny error in distance, speed, or timing meant the shell would explode too early or too late. And when that happened, the shell simply burst harmlessly in empty sky. By 1940, Allied commanders knew they had a serious problem. German aircraft were attacking cities, fleets, and supply lines across Europe and the Atlantic. Anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells during these attacks, but only a small fraction ever hit their targets. Vast amounts of ammunition were being used with surprisingly limited results. The problem became even more frightening when Germany introduced a new weapon, the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 was essentially an early cruise missile, a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives and launched toward cities like London. It traveled at speeds of more than 600 kilometers per hour and flew at relatively low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns could fire at them, but hitting one directly was extremely difficult. Defending against these threats required something entirely new. Some scientists began to imagine a revolutionary idea. What if an artillery shell didn't need to hit the target at all? What if it could detect when it was close enough and explode automatically? It sounded almost impossible. Artillery shells experience violent forces when they are fired from a gun. The acceleration can exceed 20,000 times the force of gravity. Any delicate electronic equipment placed inside a shell would normally be crushed or shattered instantly. Yet a small group of scientists believed it might be possible. In 1940, the United States government quietly launched one of the most secret research programs of the war. The work was assigned to researchers at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Their task was simple to describe, but incredibly difficult to accomplish: create a fuse that could detect its target automatically while flying through the air. The scientists began exploring a new technology that was still in its infancy: radar. Radar had already proven useful for detecting aircraft from the ground by bouncing radio waves off objects in the sky. But shrinking an entire radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell seemed almost absurd. The device would need to contain a transmitter, a receiver, a power source, and delicate electronic components, all packed into a metal cylinder only a few centimeters wide. And it would also have to survive the brutal shock of being fired from a cannon. Early experiments were discouraging. Prototype circuits shattered, vacuum tubes cracked under the intense acceleration, batteries failed instantly. Every test seemed to reveal a new technical obstacle. But the scientists refused to give up. They redesigned the electronics again and again, creating special miniature vacuum tubes with reinforced structures. They developed ruggedized circuits capable of withstanding enormous forces. Engineers even experimented with potting the components in protective materials to prevent them from breaking apart during launch. Slowly, the idea that once seemed impossible began to look achievable. The concept was elegant. As the shell flew through the air, the tiny radar transmitter in its nose would emit radio waves. If the shell approached an aircraft or even the ground, the radio waves would bounce back toward the fuse. When the reflected signal became strong enough, the system would trigger the detonator. The shell would explode automatically at exactly the right moment. Instead of needing a direct hit, the explosion would occur near the target, spraying fragments outward at lethal speed. In theory, even a near miss could destroy an aircraft. The potential impact of this technology was enormous. A single artillery shell equipped with such a fuse could become dramatically more effective. Anti-aircraft batteries might destroy enemy planes with far fewer shots. Entire skies could become deadly for attacking bombers. But secrecy was absolutely critical. If the enemy discovered the technology too early and recovered an unexploded shell, they might reverse engineer the system and develop their own version. For that reason, early testing was conducted under strict security. Scientists, engineers, and military officers working on the project often had only partial knowledge of the program's full purpose. Even the name of the device was kept deliberately vague. They called it the proximity fuse. At first, only a handful of people truly understood how important it might become. Yet those who worked on the project began to realize they were developing something extraordinary, a weapon that could fundamentally change the effectiveness of artillery on the modern battlefield. The challenge now was proving that this delicate piece of electronic technology could survive the violence of war and actually function inside a shell traveling hundreds of meters per second. If it worked, artillery would never be the same again.
By the time the idea of the proximity fuse began to take shape, the scientists working on it realized they were attempting something that had never been done before. They were trying to build a tiny radar system small enough to fit inside the nose of an artillery shell, while also making sure it could survive one of the most violent mechanical events imaginable. When a shell is fired from a cannon, it experiences acceleration forces that can exceed 20,000 times the force of gravity. To understand what that means, imagine dropping a delicate radio from a tall building, then hitting it with a sledgehammer the moment it lands. That level of shock would destroy almost any electronic device built at the time. And yet, the proximity fuse would need to survive exactly that. Inside the laboratories of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, teams of physicists, engineers, and technicians worked around the clock to solve the problem. Many of them had previously worked in radio engineering, radar development, or experimental physics. Now they faced a completely new challenge: miniaturization under extreme stress. The earliest prototypes were fragile and unreliable. Vacuum tubes, the heart of electronic circuits in the 1940s, were especially vulnerable. Their thin glass structures cracked instantly when subjected to the acceleration of a gun firing. Batteries collapsed, wires snapped, and circuits simply disintegrated. Every test firing seemed to destroy another design. But instead of abandoning the idea, the scientists began redesigning every component from scratch. They built special miniature vacuum tubes with thicker glass and reinforced internal structures. These tubes were only a few centimeters long, but they were strong enough to survive incredible forces. Even the batteries had to be reinvented. Traditional batteries would lose their electrical connection under the shock of firing, so engineers developed a special type of reserve battery that activated only after the shell was launched. When the projectile spun through the air, the internal chemicals would mix, generating power at the exact moment it was needed. Another problem came from the shell's rotation. Artillery shells spin rapidly as they travel through the air, sometimes more than 200 revolutions per second. That spinning motion helped stabilize the projectile, but it also created intense centrifugal forces that threatened to tear internal components apart. To solve this, engineers carefully balanced every piece of the fuse assembly and secured the electronics inside protective housings. Some components were even embedded in protective materials that acted like shock absorbers, preventing them from shattering during launch. Slowly, test by test, the designs began to survive the firing process. But survival was only the first step. The fuse still had to perform its real function while traveling at incredible speed through the sky. The concept relied on radar, but it worked in a much simpler way than the large radar systems used on ships or ground stations. A tiny radio transmitter inside the fuse emitted continuous radio waves as the shell flew toward its target. When those waves encountered a solid object, such as an aircraft or the ground, they bounced back toward the shell. A small receiver inside the fuse detected those reflections. As the shell approached the target, the reflected signal grew stronger and stronger. When it crossed a certain threshold, the electronic circuit triggered the detonator. In a fraction of a second, the shell exploded. To the enemy below, it would appear as if the shell had exploded in midair for no reason. But in reality, the fuse had calculated the perfect moment automatically. Even a near miss could become deadly. Fragments from an artillery shell travel at extremely high speeds, often faster than rifle bullets. When a shell burst close to an aircraft, those fragments could rip through wings, engines, fuel tanks, and control surfaces. A direct hit was no longer necessary. This idea completely changed the mathematics of anti-aircraft warfare. Instead of relying on precise timing or lucky impacts, gunners could fill the sky with shells that automatically detonated near enemy aircraft. The probability of destroying the target dramatically increased. Yet the technology remained highly experimental. Throughout 1941 and 1942, hundreds of test firings were conducted to refine the design. Some shells exploded too early, others failed to detonate at all. Engineers analyzed every failure carefully, adjusting circuits, strengthening components, and improving the reliability of the system. Gradually, the success rate improved. By the time the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the proximity fuse project had already made enormous progress. Military leaders began to understand that this strange and delicate device might soon become one of the most powerful technological advantages of the entire conflict. But one concern remained above all others. If a proximity-fused shell ever landed unexploded in enemy territory, the technology could fall into enemy hands. German or Japanese scientists might study it, copy it, and build their own versions. For that reason, the first combat deployments had to be chosen carefully. The U.S. Navy would play a crucial role in the next phase of the weapon's development. War at sea offered a unique advantage. If a shell malfunctioned and failed to explode, it would most likely fall harmlessly into the ocean, far away from enemy scientists. This made naval combat the perfect testing ground. Soon, a small number of warships would carry the new weapon into battle for the first time. The crews operating those guns often had little idea that they were about to use one of the most revolutionary pieces of technology ever placed inside an artillery shell. What happened next would prove that the impossible invention created inside a laboratory could work in the chaos of real combat. And once it did, the balance of power in the skies above the battlefield would begin to change.
By the early years of the war, the proximity fuse had moved beyond theory and laboratory testing. The scientists and engineers who had spent countless hours solving its technical problems now faced a much more important question: would the device actually work in combat? The United States military understood that the first deployment had to be handled with extreme caution. The technology was so secret that many officials feared the consequences if it fell into enemy hands.
If an unexploded shell landed on land and was recovered by German or Japanese forces, their scientists might reverse engineer the design. Because of this risk, the first operational use of the proximity fuse was assigned to the United States Navy. Naval combat offered a crucial advantage. If a shell malfunctioned or failed to explode, it would most likely fall into the open ocean where it could never be recovered. This made warships the ideal place to test the new weapon under real battlefield conditions. In early 1943, several American ships operating in the Pacific quietly received ammunition equipped with the mysterious new fuse. The crews were told very little about how it worked. Many sailors simply knew that they had been given a new type of shell that was supposed to improve their chances against enemy aircraft. One of the ships selected for these early trials was the light cruiser USS Helena, CL-50. The ship was already heavily involved in fierce fighting during the Solomon Islands campaign, a brutal series of naval and air battles between American and Japanese forces. The skies above the Solomon Islands were extremely dangerous. Japanese aircraft frequently attacked Allied ships, attempting to bomb or torpedo them. Anti-aircraft gunners worked constantly to defend their vessels, firing thousands of shells into the sky whenever enemy planes appeared. Before the proximity fuse, those gunners faced a frustrating reality. Most shells either missed completely or exploded too far from their targets to cause serious damage. Even when dozens of guns fired simultaneously, enemy aircraft could still slip through the defensive fire. The arrival of the new shells promised to change that. When the first batches of proximity-fused ammunition were loaded aboard American warships, strict secrecy surrounded their use. Officers were instructed not to discuss the technology outside of essential personnel. In many cases, the sailors firing the guns had no idea they were using a revolutionary invention. They simply loaded the shells, aimed their weapons, and fired. The difference became noticeable almost immediately. Instead of exploding randomly in the sky, some shells began detonating much closer to the attacking aircraft. To the gunners watching from the decks below, it looked as if the shells were somehow sensing the enemy planes and bursting at exactly the right moment. When fragments from these explosions struck aircraft wings or engines, the results were devastating. Even planes that were not directly hit by the shell itself could be torn apart by the high-velocity metal fragments. Enemy pilots suddenly found themselves flying into clouds of explosions that seemed almost alive. Reports from the Pacific began reaching military commanders. Ships using the new fuse were shooting down enemy aircraft at significantly higher rates than before. Anti-aircraft fire had become far more dangerous. Yet the sailors involved often did not fully understand why. To them, it simply appeared that their gunners were suddenly becoming much more accurate. In reality, the fuse itself was doing much of the work. Each shell carried its own tiny radar system, constantly scanning the air around it as it flew toward the target. When the shell passed close enough to an aircraft, the radar signal bounced back strongly enough to trigger the detonator. The explosion occurred automatically, without the need for precise timing or direct impact. For the first time in history, artillery shells were capable of sensing their environment and reacting to it. The success of these early naval deployments quickly convinced military planners that the proximity fuse could become one of the most important technologies of the war. Production began to increase rapidly as factories worked to manufacture thousands, then millions of the tiny devices. Despite this success, secrecy remained absolute. Even within the military, only a limited number of officers knew exactly how the fuse worked. Commanders understood that if a single unexploded shell were recovered intact, the entire advantage could disappear. Because of that risk, the weapon was initially restricted to naval operations and certain carefully controlled environments. but the growing effectiveness of the proximity fuse soon created pressure to expand its use. Allied forces fighting on land were facing their own deadly challenges, especially in Europe, where German troops and weapons continued to resist Allied advances. Artillery had always been one of the most powerful weapons on the battlefield, yet even there, traditional shells often exploded harmlessly after striking the ground. Military planners began to imagine what might happen if proximity-fused shells were used against enemy soldiers instead of aircraft. If a shell could explode automatically in the air just above the ground, its fragments would spread outward over a wide area, striking troops hiding in trenches, forests, or defensive positions. Instead of burying itself in the soil before detonating, the shell would burst at the perfect height to maximize its destructive power. The implications were enormous. But introducing such a powerful weapon onto land battlefields would require a difficult decision. The risk of enemy capture would increase dramatically. A shell that failed to explode could easily fall into German hands. Despite those fears, the situation in Europe was becoming desperately enough that commanders began to reconsider the risks. Soon, the proximity fuse would move from the oceans of the Pacific to one of the most brutal ground battles of the entire war. And when it arrived there, its impact would be immediate, terrifying, and impossible to ignore.
By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical moment. Allied forces had successfully landed in France and were pushing deeper into German-held territory. Many commanders believed the German army was already close to collapse. But in December of that year, Germany launched one last massive offensive designed to shatter the Allied lines. The attack came in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg and quickly became known as the Battle of the Bulge. German armored divisions smashed through thinly defended sections of the front, creating a huge bulge in the Allied lines and threatening to split the Allied armies in half. The winter conditions were brutal. Snow covered the forests, visibility was often poor, and the narrow roads made movement difficult. American infantry units suddenly found themselves facing experienced German troops supported by tanks and artillery. The situation quickly became desperate. Allied commanders needed every advantage they could find, and for the first time, they were willing to take a risk with one of the most closely guarded technologies of the war, the proximity fuse. Until this moment, the fuse had mostly been used at sea against aircraft. Now, military planners decided to deploy it with field artillery on land. The idea was simple, but incredibly powerful. Instead of exploding when it hit the ground, the shell would detonate automatically in the air just above the battlefield. When a traditional artillery shell strikes the earth before exploding, much of its energy is absorbed by the ground. Dirt and debris limit the spread of metal fragments. But when a shell bursts several meters above the surface, the fragments spread outward in every direction with nothing to block them. For soldiers on the ground, the effect could be devastating. German troops advancing through forests, hiding behind cover, or moving along roads suddenly found themselves caught beneath explosions that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Shells burst high above their heads, showering the area with deadly fragments traveling at enormous speeds. Even soldiers lying flat on the ground were vulnerable. Artillery units equipped with proximity-fused shells began firing into areas where German forces were assembling or advancing. Entire formations could be disrupted by a barrage of airburst explosions. Trees shattered, snow exploded into the air, and metal fragments tore through anything exposed below. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical destruction. German soldiers had grown accustomed to traditional artillery patterns. They knew that if they hugged the ground or hid in shallow cover, they might survive nearby explosions. But the new shells behaved differently. The bursts came from above, raining fragments downward in a deadly storm. Many troops reported feeling as if the sky itself had turned against them.
American artillery officers quickly realized how effective the new fuse could be in forested terrain. The thick woods of the Ardennes created perfect conditions for airburst explosions. When shells detonated above the treetops, fragments ricocheted off branches and trunks, spreading even more unpredictably through the forest. German units attempting to advance through these woods suddenly faced invisible explosions tearing through their ranks. One of the commanders who quickly recognized the value of the new technology was George S. Patton. Known for his aggressive leadership and belief in mobility and firepower, Patton was always eager to adopt weapons that could give his forces an advantage. He reportedly referred to the proximity fuse as the funny fuse, a nickname that reflected both its mysterious nature and its devastating effectiveness. To Patton and many other officers, the results spoke for themselves. Artillery units equipped with the fuse could inflict far greater damage on enemy troops with fewer shells. Barrages that once required hundreds of rounds could now achieve the same effect with far less ammunition. German advances slowed as their units encountered increasingly intense artillery fire. The proximity fuse helped transform American artillery into one of the most effective battlefield weapons of the entire war. German soldiers soon noticed something strange about the explosions they were encountering. Some believed the Allies had developed a new type of radar-guided artillery. Others suspected secret timed fuses or new forms of aerial bombardment. But the true explanation remained hidden. Because of the risk of capture, strict rules governed how the shells were used. Artillery crews were instructed to fire them only when enemy troops were actively advancing or when the likelihood of recovery was low. Commanders understood that if even one intact fuse were recovered by German scientists, the entire technological advantage could disappear. Fortunately for the Allies, that never happened during the crucial phases of the battle. As the fighting continued through the freezing winter of 1944 and early 1945, German forces gradually lost momentum. Their offensive stalled, and Allied units began pushing them back across the same forests and towns where the attack had begun. The proximity fuse was not the only factor that determined the outcome of the battle, but many commanders believed it played a crucial role. Artillery equipped with the new fuse broke up German troop movements, disrupted assaults, and inflicted heavy casualties on advancing units. In terrain where visibility was limited and air support was often impossible because of the weather, the ability to deliver precise airburst artillery proved incredibly valuable. Years later, several military historians would point to the proximity fuse as one of the hidden technological advantages that helped the Allies survive the German offensive. And while soldiers on the ground simply saw explosions tearing through the winter sky, few of them realized they were witnessing the battlefield debut of a technology that would influence warfare for generations to come. But the proximity fuse was not finished changing the war. Its most dramatic successes were still ahead, against weapons and enemies that had once seemed almost impossible to stop.
By the final months of the Second World War, the proximity fuse had already proven itself on both sea and land. What had begun as a risky scientific experiment had become one of the most effective battlefield technologies ever developed during the conflict. Yet its most dramatic demonstrations of power were still unfolding. One of the greatest threats facing Allied cities in 1944 came from a new German weapon known as the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 was a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives and launched toward targets such as London. Once launched, its small pulse-jet engine carried it across the English Channel at speeds of more than 600 kilometers per hour. The weapon was terrifyingly simple. It flew at low altitude, made a loud buzzing sound, and then suddenly went silent just seconds before impact. When the engine stopped, the bomb would fall and explode wherever it happened to be. British civilians quickly learned to fear that silence. Stopping the V-1 proved extremely difficult. Fighter aircraft could intercept some of them, but the small flying bombs were fast and often traveled in large numbers. Anti-aircraft guns also attempted to shoot them down, but hitting such a fast-moving target with traditional timed fuses was incredibly challenging. Then, proximity fuses were introduced into the air defense system protecting Britain. Suddenly, the effectiveness of anti-aircraft guns increased dramatically. Instead of requiring a direct hit, the shells only needed to pass near the flying bomb before detonating automatically. The airburst explosions sprayed fragments into the V-1's thin metal body, damaging the engine or triggering the explosive payload. The results were astonishing. In some sectors, anti-aircraft units equipped with proximity-fused shells achieved kill rates approaching 80%. What had once been a nearly unstoppable weapon was now being destroyed in large numbers before it could reach its targets. The new fuse had turned the sky itself into a deadly barrier. But the technology would prove just as powerful in another theater of war, thousands of kilometers away. In the Pacific, American naval forces were fighting one of the most intense battles of the entire conflict during the Battle of Okinawa. Japanese forces had begun using large numbers of suicide aircraft known as kamikazes, pilots who intentionally crashed their planes into Allied ships in an effort to sink them. These attacks were terrifyingly dangerous. Even a single aircraft packed with explosives could severely damage or destroy a warship if it managed to get close enough. American ships relied heavily on anti-aircraft guns to defend themselves, but kamikaze pilots were determined and often flew directly into the defensive fire. Here again, the proximity fuse made a dramatic difference. As enemy aircraft approached, American destroyers and cruisers filled the sky with shells that automatically detonated near the incoming planes. Instead of relying on precise hits, the gunners created lethal bursts of fragments around the attackers. In one famous example, a single destroyer reportedly shot down 23 attacking aircraft in roughly 90 minutes using proximity-fused ammunition. Without the technology, many of those planes might have reached their targets. Across the Pacific Fleet, the new fuse helped transform naval air defense. Kamikaze pilots still managed to damage many ships, but the number of aircraft destroyed before reaching their targets increased significantly. By the end of the war, millions of proximity fuses had been produced and used across multiple battlefronts. Artillery units, naval gunners, and air defense batteries all benefited from the technology's ability to turn near misses into lethal explosions. Military leaders began to recognize just how important the invention had been. The United States War Department later ranked the proximity fuse as one of the most significant technological achievements of the entire war, second only to the development of the atomic bomb. That ranking placed it above many other famous wartime innovations, including radar improvements, advanced aircraft, and new tank designs. For the scientists who had worked on the project, the success was extraordinary. What had started as a nearly impossible engineering challenge, placing a radar system inside an artillery shell, had evolved into a weapon that reshaped the effectiveness of artillery and air defense. Yet the story of the proximity fuse did not end with the Second World War. The core idea behind the device, detecting a target automatically and triggering an explosion at the optimal moment, became the foundation for many modern weapons. Variations of the technology were later incorporated into guided missiles, advanced anti-aircraft systems, and sophisticated smart munitions used by militaries around the world. Today, modern proximity sensors can be found in everything from air-to-air missiles to naval defense systems designed to intercept incoming threats. All of them trace their origins back to the small group of scientists and engineers who solved one of the most difficult problems of wartime engineering in the early 1940s. Their invention changed a fundamental rule of warfare. For centuries, artillery had relied on direct hits or carefully timed explosions. But the proximity fuse introduced a new principle, a weapon that could sense its surroundings and decide the exact moment to strike. It meant that a shell no longer needed to hit its target to destroy it. Sometimes, getting close was more than enough.